Hi everybody, welcome back. Right, now we're going to start delving deeper into open data. Now we're going to have a series of presentations and a panel discussion on called an open and shut case, open data and open shut case, and primarily to explore the kind of and unpick the hype behind open data. Some of you may have heard or seen kind of McKinsey reports saying how many trillions of value open data will add to our economies, and in some cases in the UK, this far exceed the actual economy of the UK. So it needs unpicking a little bit. A few bits of housekeeping to start off with. Obviously, you've all turned your mobile phones onto silent. And if you are going to tweet, there are various social media channels, and if you hashtag them with data opens doors or hashtag ask Dublinked, Dublinked? It's got Dublinked here. I think it's Dublinked. Please do so. We kind of encourage an active social media presence as well. I'm going to be inviting the speakers to come to the podium one by one, who will do the presentations, and then I'll be inviting them to sit down. And after all the presentations, we'll then go through a kind of discussion and then invite the audience to question and challenge the speakers. So, I think we've already gone through the where the toilets are, and if there's a fire alarm, follow me, because I'll be running very fast. Right, so speaking in this session, we will have firstly Professor Rob Kitchin. Rob Kitchin is part of the Programmable City Unit at Maynooth University. I've known of Rob for a while through his writings such as Code Space and the Data Revolution, and his various takes on the smart city, and I advise people to read them because they are really thoughtful and actually really a good critique of data practice as it is present. He'll be speaking first, and then Pamela Duncan, Irish Times journalist, who works for the contributor to the Irish Times Data, which is a blog specialising in analysis of data sets to provide new insight and to create stories from them. After that, we will have Dr. Francesco Calabresi from Smarter Urban Dynamics, IBM Research Ireland. He manages the Smarter Urban Dynamics group, focusing on the development of analytics and tools to better understand and optimize urban dynamics. So it's a very interesting field. Then Denis Parfanov, founder of Open Knowledge Ireland and ambassador for the Open Knowledge Foundation, an entrepreneur and passionate about empowering citizens through open data. And finally, I'll invite Phil Lang from the Open Data Institute from London, who is digital production editor, and you manage the multimedia content that is produced from there, and a lot of it is too. So without further ado, I would like to invite Rob to the lectern.
Okay. Yep, I'm going to try and rattle through this. So I was kind of asked to be a kind of a devil's advocate and think about whether this open data is as good as commons as a lot of the hype makes out. So I think we can safely say there's a kind of a data revolution happening. There's more and more data being produced about people, about objects, about territories, about transactions and interactions than at any other time in history. And that these data are increasingly granular, they're indexical, and they're relational. So they're about individual people, individual objects, individual places. We have a unique identifiers. We can link them together across different databases and so on. And we're just generating a lot more data, often through kind of automated processes, and they include things like scientific data, business data, and data that companies generate through their CRM and their ERPs and all this kind of stuff, official statistical data, public administration data, and then big data both within the public and the private sphere. And we've heard about some of this kind of data, such as the real-time traffic, car parking, environmental monitoring, water levels, whatever it might be. And increasingly, as part of cities now, we start to see these kinds of control rooms. The top left one there is in Rio. The bottom right one is actually just for a single road. This is the M25 control room. outside of London, and then a series of kind of dashboards and interfaces and ways of which we can try and make sense of and get a handle on some of these kinds of data. So the top right is from the Dublin dashboard, and on that has road speeds, it has the number of spaces in car parks, and it has information about the bike stations. And the bottom left here is a real-time London data feed where it's giving you information about the tube, the weather, what's going on in the news, and so on. And all of this kind of data is providing key insights for those people that generate and analyze them. And the argument of the open data movement is much more value could be extracted and derived from those data if they were open in nature and they were available for everybody to examine and use. And the open data movement almost exclusively focuses on public sector data, and it's about recasting public sector information, PSI, into a public commons so that everybody can kind of access that data and look at it. And the argument generally used to promote it is that open data will create transparency and accountability with respect to public bodies and services. It will increase the efficiency and the productivity of agencies and enhance their governance. It will promote participation and decision-making and social innovation and so on. And it will also foster economic innovation, job and wealth creation through enabling new entrepreneurial opportunities for startups for already established businesses and so on. And those kind of arguments are a very powerful set of arguments, and they've led to a whole series of data initiatives, open data initiatives across the globe, and they've really been growing in number. At the same time, we can trace open data a long way back into the 20th century. People seem to think the genealogy starts in 2009 and the White House kind of declaration, but actually it goes way back. And if you look at something like the Antarctic Treaty from whenever it was, 1953 or something, and you look at the 10 principles of that data, they're almost identical to the Open Data Initiative's principles, almost word for word identical. All the data will be open and shared freely across nations, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So there is actually a long history, particularly within scientific communities, of opening and sharing data between different communities and so on. So we also have to kind of start to put this in a bit more of a kind of a historical narrative as well. And obviously there's lots of questions concerning open data, I think, that's still open, and Julian's talk very much pointed to some of that. And these are just some of the projects that I've been involved in. So the Aero project in the top left there, All Ireland Research Observatory, started in 2005. Open data sets for the whole Ireland, North and South, mainly public administration data, but most of what you can think of. But a whole set of tools to actually enable you to use the data. So it doesn't just provide you with the data, it gives you a whole set of tools so you can play around with the data and so on. Obviously, the Dublin dashboard has been mentioned already this morning. Again, trying to pull together all the different types of data related to the city, put them into one place, and also give people tools to be able to play around with that data. And all the data in there is open, so there's no closed data in there. So any of the data we use, anybody else can use, including all the real-time data, which is obviously available through Dublinked. And then the DRI is the Digital Repository of Ireland, which is an open, trusted digital repository. It's not fully open because there's all kinds of issues around copyright and intellectual property and all of the kinds of bits and pieces that we're all trying to work through and so on. But it's pulling together the data from all the national museums, national galleries, National Library, RTE, and so on and so forth, and will be launched in June, fingers crossed. So kind of critiques or thinking a bit more critically about open data. So the financial model is one of the kind of key things that people don't like to talk about. Open data is not free data. Somebody has to produce it. There is labour involved. There's equipment involved. There's all kinds of things happening to make that data available. Okay? It is true that it can be distributed for marginal cost. Put it up on a website, other people can pull it down. Multiple people can pull it down with no additional cost and so on. But its initial creation does have significant cost. So it might be a free resource for end users, but its production and curation is certainly not without significant cost, especially with respect to the technologies and labour and so on. Obviously, there's an issue here around the state recouping its own cost on trying to produce this data, particularly in a time of austerity. So the state is already really pushed at what it does, and now it's been asked to do a whole series of other things, and it's how you go about funding that when their budgets are being cut. So this is kind of one of the issues, and often one of the things we find with trying to open data is they're quite willing to open the data, but they don't have either the in-house capacity or the resources to maybe create the API. So that then becomes the blockage. And that actually needs funding to resolve. That can't just be resolved magically. And in some cases, those organisations, the data is a significant chunk of its revenue. So for something like Ordnance Survey, where it might be 50% of its revenue, if you tell them that that has to go for free, then the question is who is actually paying for the update and upkeep and management of the existing data and adding the new data in, particularly when it's a type of data that is a public commons good that wouldn't be done by the private sector if it was fully opened, because there'd be no profit in it. It's the same kind of argument around broadband. The reason why there's no broadband in a lot of rural areas is because you can't make a profit on it. You need a certain scale and mass and density. So the state maps places that other people wouldn't map. They do it as the public good. And it's the same with other kinds of data sets. So if you open that up, and that's also part of their cost recovery model, they're a trading fund. What replaces it? And what replaces it when it's a significant cost, when it's employing 200 people, for example. Okay? And we haven't really figured that out. What we're doing is looking for the low-hanging fruit that we can kind of push out on a marginal cost, rather than some of the really high-value data sets that are being used to actually fund the state. And we've been looking at this with the DRI, because our state funding runs out in August, and we've been looking at various different models of how we go about funding this when we can't charge anything. So when you can't charge anything, how do you fund yourself to produce all of this data relating to National Library, National Gallery, National Archives, and so on and so forth? So these are some of the things we've been looking at around institutional sources of funding, research for sources of funding, audience kinds of funding, so people actually paying for services, not paying for the data, but paying for services, or kind of things like advertising, white label development, and so on, and kind of volunteering stuff, crowdsourcing stuff. So these are all different kind of models that we've been exploring, and we're actually exploring a blended model of this to try and make ourselves sustainable. Economic benefits, lots of arguments about economic benefits, most of it largely unproven. As Julian was already kind of saying about the value to the market and so on. It's very clear that you can make money around things like location, weather, and travel. You can't make money on travel if there's like 54 apps all doing travel for your area and you're dividing it amongst all of your everybody. All the apps fail, basically. It's very difficult to convert open data into a paid consumer product and employment, and the vast majority of apps that use open data actually die, and about 90% of them get less than 100 downloads, I think I read somewhere recently. And many of the companies are actually surviving on venture capital and are trying to get to a point where they have critical mass that they can while they try and find a sustainable business model that would enable them to generate an income. And there's also an argument that partly what's happening here is there's a business sector agenda basically to gain access to data that would have cost them a lot of money for no cost, and effectively get a heavily subsidised infrastructural state support from which a product can be leveraged. So the reason why you have big multinationals advocating for open data is there's nothing to do with transparency and everything to do with the economic value they can generate from the data. And in most cases, the state is actually the target of selling the derived data back to. Okay, so the biggest target group for buying the data is actually the state. Okay, so in which case the old model actually worked fine. You know, and obviously there's a lot of companies who actually try to block opening of the data because their whole model was based on licensing and reusing of data that they bought from the public sector, added value to, and then sold on. So open data actually destroyed their business model of some existing companies, and they then having to be adapt. And we didn't really think about that. We just, you know, this is creative destruction and it will create something else. There's obviously a politics of open data, and Julian alluded to this. So we largely focus on access to the data, in believing that that's an inherently good thing. But we actually ignore the politics of the data themselves. So what do those data reveal? How are they used, and for whose interests? So PSI data in and of itself is inherently political. You know, systems are designed to capture certain things, to be used in particular ways, and to serve state and political interests. And certain groups are a lot more captured within state systems than other groups. For example, people who are on welfare, people who have kids, and so on. And the data has been collected for a particular purpose and to enact something. So the data is designed to tell you certain things, and obviously this data is not collected about other things. So those value structures inherently are embedded into those data sets, and they shape sort of what you can do with them and how you would interpret them. And the argument being by some is that this is actually being used to empower the empowered, and disenfranchise others. So it's normally people who are reasonably well educated and reasonably wealthy who have the data literacy to actually be able to understand this data, to employ this data, and to use it to serve their interests. They're not necessarily doing it for the greater public good. And there's kinds of issues there. And there's, the high-profile example of this was open data used in India that was used to dispossess people of their land. So people who were educated and literate could take the data and then claim the land and dispossess other people who basically haven't got a clue what was going on. Okay? And so there's a kind of a question as whether the demographic potential of open data has actually been over-optimistic, and we actually need to be much more sensitive to looking at what's going on here and critical about what's going on. Third kind of issues around usability and utility. So there's been a number of studies now kind of saying a lot of these open data sites are actually just open data dumps, and they don't really add a lot of value. There's no real attention to usability, to quality of content, to consequences of use. There's nothing around data quality, about provenance, about lineage, about proper metadata, about calibration, about reliability, about bias, about, I get this data set, I just have to trust that that's all 100% right. None of this data is published with any of that kind of information, usually. I don't know if it's been calibrated, to what extent it's been calibrated. I don't know what the margins of error are in it. I just have to trust that it does show what it does. But as Julian's also pointed out, a lot of this data is spaghetti, a lot of it's difficult to understand, a lot of it's in all kinds of arcane formats, and you spend a whole heap of time trying to work out what the hell's going on in it. And a lot of what's been going on at the minute is just to pick the low-hanging fruit, data sets that are easy to open up, but often with very little intrinsic value, which is actually why the data is not used. It doesn't really tell you anything that useful. And also, it often lacks the tools and the contextual materials to support the data analysis. So you don't know the context in which the data was collected, and therefore it makes it difficult to then know how to interpret the data, because you're not provided with that information. And a lot of sites, and Julian again had a good example with the Oakland one, have low and declining traffic, as they don't encourage use or reuse, and users actually struggle to work out what to do with the data, or how to make sense of it, or how they can deploy it, and so on. And some analysis now is showing that a lot of this data has had very, very limited impact on policy and policy debates, which is one of the prime reasons it was argued that it should be opened. Okay. Also, one of the things that I find kind of interesting is there's very little debate going on around opening up private information, so private company data. So it's often related to public goods. And a lot of private companies are providing public goods or public services on private contracts, and there's issues around whether that data. So I heard a government minister in the UK saying a lot of the really important data about cities in the UK they don't have access to because they privatised it. They privatised the utilities, they privatised a lot of the transport routes, they privatised parts of education, they privatised their lighting, they don't have access to any of that data, they privatised it. So a lot of key data sets for cities don't have access to. And is there an argument for companies to open data in the same way that they've open source software? And what would be the spillover effects of companies sharing data between themselves and sharing data with the public and having kind of open innovation, open entrepreneurship? It'd be very interesting to see debates around that and to see whether companies who are quite happy for the public sector to open their data so they can extract a value, whether they would do the same with their own data. Okay? And there needs to be, I think there needs to be a lot more about what is opening data enough. There needs to be more than open data dumps. It needs proper infrastructure, proper preservation, archive and sharing strategies, proper reuse, privacy, ethical policies, proper administrative arrangements, proper financial stability, long-term planning and development. It's really great to see Dublinked has got long-term funding now. But it's also important to realise that opening data doesn't necessarily improve governance within an organisation, and really what we need to be looking at is organisations becoming data-driven organisations, actually going back to first principles. Are we asking the right questions? Are we collecting the right data? Are we then managing, structuring, processing and sharing that data in the right way, and that goes through, rather than saying opening the data now makes us magically improve our governance. Okay? It's actually bringing the whole data process and the data management and the infrastructure right the way back through the organisation to the base. And I think that's one of the processes. Just opening the data isn't simply enough, and it requires more. So I'm getting the wind up, so I'll leave you read that yourself, which basically just says it's not completely an open and shut case, and there's a whole series of open questions I think that we need to talk about.